The Empire captured humanity's last engineer. He asked to see their warship. The sky over the ruins of New Denver was still burning 3 days after the last human fleet fell. Smoke rose from broken towers like gray fingers reaching for a sky that no longer belonged to Earth. The Krithar Empire had come with ships the size of small moons, and humanity, for all its courage, could not stop them. Daniel Voss sat in the dust of what used to be his workshop, hands bound behind his back with a cold metal clamp. He was not a soldier. He never had been. He was an engineer, the kind of man who spent his life inside the guts of machines, fixing what others thought was broken beyond repair. At 42 years old, with gray creeping into his beard and grease permanently stained into the lines of his hands, he did not look like someone who mattered. But he did matter. He was, as far as anyone could tell, the last engineer of the Earth Defense Fleet still alive. Every other name on that list was dead, captured and executed, or missing. Daniel had survived because he had been deep underground in a maintenance tunnel when the final battle ended, patching a coolant line on a reactor that no longer had a ship to power. 2 Krithar soldiers pulled him to his feet. They were tall, nearly 8 feet, with gray-blue skin that looked like wet stone and eyes that glowed faintly amber in the dark. Their armor hummed with a low energy that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up. He had seen this armor before, in the last days of the war, tearing through human tanks like paper. "Move," one of them said in broken English, translated through a device on its collar. The voice was flat, mechanical, without any warmth. Daniel moved. He had no other choice. As they marched him out of the ruins of his workshop, he looked back once at the wreckage of his life's work, half-built drone frames, scattered tools, a chalkboard covered in equations that would never be finished now. He felt something twist in his chest, but he did not let it show on his face. Showing weakness now would help no one. They took him to a landing field outside the city, where a transport ship waited. It was small compared to the warships he had seen destroy Earth's defenses, but it was still larger than anything humanity had ever built. Its hull was smooth and dark, almost like polished obsidian, with strange lines of light running along its sides like veins. As they pushed him up the ramp, Daniel could not stop himself from staring. Every engineer has a curse, and his was simple. He could not look at a machine without wanting to understand it. Even now, captured, defeated, with his own species crushed beneath the boots of an empire that spanned 100 star systems, some small part of his mind was already asking questions. How do the engines work? What is powering the lights? Why does the hull not reflect light the way metal should? Inside the ship, they placed him in a small holding cell with a single bench and a wall that glowed faintly blue, some kind of energy barrier instead of bars. Daniel sat down, his wrists still bound, and waited. He did not know what they wanted with him. Interrogation, most likely, or execution if they decided he was useless. He did not have to wait long. A different kind of Krithar entered the room after some hours. This one wore robes instead of armor, deep purple with gold trim, and its skin had a paler shade of blue, almost silver. It carried itself with the calm confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "You are Daniel Voss," it said, its translator device producing a smoother, more careful version of English than the soldiers had used. "Chief engineer of the human vessel Meridian before its destruction. Correct." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's me." "You built weapons that killed many of my people," the Krithar continued. Its amber eyes studied him without blinking. "You should be afraid." "I am," Daniel said honestly. There was no point in lying, but being afraid doesn't stop me from being curious. The Krithar tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost human in its confusion. Curious about what? Daniel took a breath. This was the moment. He had thought about it during the long hours in the cell, turning the idea over and over in his mind. He was a captured enemy, a defeated man with nothing left to lose. His planet was conquered. His people were scattered or dead. But he still had his mind, and his mind was the one weapon they could not take from him. "I want to see your warship," he said. "The real one, not this transport. I want to see the ship that beat us." For a long moment, the Krithar said nothing. Its eyes narrowed slightly, and Daniel could see it processing the request, trying to understand why a prisoner, a defeated enemy engineer, would ask for such a thing instead of begging for mercy or demanding to know his fate. "You wish to see the instrument of your defeat," the Krithar said slowly, as if testing the words. "Why?" Daniel shrugged, though the movement was awkward with his hands bound. "Because I'm an engineer. Because that ship is the most advanced thing I will ever see in my life, and I want to understand how it works before I die. Isn't that reasonable?" It was a strange request, and Daniel knew it. But he also knew something about power, something he had learned from years of working with people far above his rank. Power respects confidence. Fear invites cruelty, but confidence, even in a prisoner, often invites curiosity. He was betting his life on that idea now. The Krithar studied him a while longer, then spoke into a device on its wrist in its own language, a series of clicks and low tones that Daniel could not understand. After a pause, a reply came back, also in the alien tongue. The Krithar's expression, if it could be called that, shifted slightly. "You have caught the attention of Fleet Commander Zorath Vek," it said. "He has heard of your reputation, the engineer who kept a dying fleet fighting for 6 months longer than any of our projections predicted. He is curious about you as well." Daniel felt a small flicker of hope, quickly buried beneath caution. Hope was dangerous here, but it was still there. "Commander Vek has agreed to allow your request," the Krithar continued. "You will be taken to the warship Devourer of Stars. You will be permitted to view certain sections of the vessel, under guard, of course. Do not mistake this permission for kindness. The commander is interested in understanding the human mind that resisted us so effectively. You are not being rewarded. You are being studied." "I understand," Daniel said, and he did. He understood perfectly. To them he was a specimen, a puzzle to be examined and then discarded. But that was fine. A puzzle got attention. A puzzle got access. And access was exactly what an engineer needed. They moved him 2 days later. The transport docked with something so large that Daniel could not see its edges through the small viewport of his cell, only a wall of dark metal stretching in every direction like the side of a mountain. When they finally opened the ramp and marched him out, he stepped onto a landing deck large enough to hold every aircraft carrier humanity had ever built, side by side, with room to spare. The Devourer of Stars was not just a warship. It was a city, a fortress, a weapon built on a scale that made Daniel's mind struggle to process what he was seeing. Krithar crew moved across the deck in organized lines, some in armor, some in simple gray uniforms, moving cargo and machinery with practiced ease. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something metallic that Daniel could not place. 2 guards flanked him as they walked deeper into the ship. Daniel kept his eyes moving, cataloging everything he could. The thickness of the bulkheads, the placement of what looked like weapon conduits running along the ceiling, the way the lighting seemed to pulse very slightly, almost like a heartbeat, suggesting some kind of central power system running through the whole structure. They arrived at a large open chamber that Daniel guessed was some kind of command deck, though smaller than the main bridge must have been. A tall Krithar stood near a curved console, his armor darker and more ornate than the soldiers who had captured Daniel, marked with lines of gold that seemed to indicate rank. When he turned, his amber eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made the engineer's pulse quicken. "Daniel Voss," the figure said, his translator device giving him a deep, resonant voice. "Fleet Commander Zorath Vek, you asked to see my ship." "I did," Daniel replied, standing as straight as his bound hands would allow. Zorath Vek studied him the way a man might study a strange insect he had found in his garden, not quite sure if it was dangerous or merely interesting. "Your people fought harder than any species we have encountered in 300 years of expansion. Your ships were primitive compared to ours, your weapons crude, and yet you delayed our conquest for 6 months when our projections estimated 6 days. Do you know why?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. This was not a question to answer carelessly. "Because we didn't know we were supposed to lose," he said finally. "Nobody told us the math. We just kept fixing what broke and firing what still worked." Something in Zorath Vek's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible change around the eyes that might have been respect, or might have been calculation. A simple answer, perhaps too simple. I suspect there is more to it than that. Maybe, Daniel said. But you didn't bring me here for a philosophy lesson. You brought me here because I asked to see your warship, and that confused you. You want to know why a defeated prisoner would care about the ship that crushed his species instead of begging for his life. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no anger in the gesture, only sharpening focus. Continue. I care because I'm an engineer, Daniel said. This ship is the greatest piece of engineering I will ever see. Every weld, every conduit, every system on this thing represents thousands of years of knowledge that my species doesn't have. You could kill me in the next 5 minutes, and I would still want to spend those 5 minutes understanding how you built something like this. That's not weakness. That's who I am. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence, a low, steady vibration that Daniel could feel through the soles of his boots. Around the chamber, several other Krithar officers had stopped their work to watch the exchange, clearly as curious as their commander about how this would unfold. Finally, Zorath Vek made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and rumbling, though it was hard to tell through the translator. In 300 years, no prisoner has ever spoken to me this way. Most beg. Some threaten foolishly. A few go silent and refuse to speak at all. None have asked to tour my ship as though they were an honored guest instead of a captured enemy. I'm not asking to be treated as a guest, Daniel said carefully. I know what I am to you, a prisoner, a specimen, but I also know that curiosity works both ways, Commander. You want to understand why humans fought the way we did. I want to understand how your ship works. Maybe there's something useful in both of us getting what we want. Zorath Vek turned to one of his officers and spoke a short string of words in the Krithar language. The officer nodded and moved toward a console. Then the commander turned back to Daniel, his amber eyes glowing slightly brighter in the dim light of the chamber. Very well, Engineer Voss, he said. You will be given a tour of selected sections of this vessel. You will remain under guard at all times. You will touch nothing without permission. And in exchange, you will answer my questions honestly about your ships, your tactics, and your people. Do we have an understanding? Daniel felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. We do. Good, Zorath Vek said, gesturing toward a corridor leading deeper into the ship. Let us begin with the engine core. I am told humans are particularly fascinated by power generation. Perhaps you will finally understand exactly how far beyond your species we truly are. As Daniel followed the commander deeper into the belly of the great warship, flanked by guards on either side, he kept his face calm, almost humble. But inside, his engineer's mind was already working, absorbing every detail, every system, every weakness hidden within the ship's impossible power. He did not know yet what he would do with this knowledge. He only knew that knowledge, once gained, could never be taken back. And somewhere far behind him, in the ashes of a conquered Earth, the last scattered remnants of humanity were still alive, still hiding, still waiting for something, anything, that might give them a reason to hope again. Daniel Voss intended to give them that reason. He just had to survive long enough to find it. The corridor leading to the engine core of the Devourer of Stars stretched longer than any hallway Daniel Voss had ever walked. The walls were smooth and dark, lined with faint blue conduits that pulsed gently, like veins carrying something alive through the ship's body. Guards walked on either side of him, their heavy boots striking the metal floor in perfect rhythm, while Commander Zorath Vek led the way with the calm confidence of a man walking through his own home. Daniel kept quiet, watching everything. He noticed how the corridor slightly widened near certain junctions, likely to allow maintenance crews to pass with equipment. He noticed small vents along the ceiling, spaced at even intervals, almost certainly part of a heat management system. He noticed that despite the ship's massive size, there was very little wasted space. Everything here had a purpose. You are quiet, Engineer Voss, Zorath Vek said without turning around. I expected more questions. I'm saving them, Daniel replied. I don't want to waste your patience on small things when we haven't even reached the engine yet. The commander made that low rumbling sound again, the one Daniel now recognized as something close to amusement. A wise strategy. Most prisoners waste their opportunities on fear. You waste nothing. They reached a massive set of doors, thick and reinforced, guarded by two more soldiers in heavier armor than the ones Daniel had seen before. The doors slid open with a deep mechanical groan, revealing a chamber so large that Daniel almost stopped walking out of sheer shock. The engine core was not a single machine. It was an entire structure, rising several stories high, filled with glowing conduits, spinning rings of dark metal, and a central column of blue-white light that pulsed with slow, steady power. The air itself seemed to hum, vibrating against Daniel's skin. He had worked on nuclear reactors before, on fusion cores that powered Earth's largest warships, and none of it compared to what stood before him now. "This is the primary power core," Zorath Vek said, his voice carrying a note of pride he did not bother to hide. "It converts compressed stellar matter into usable energy. A single core like this could power your entire planet's civilization for 1,000 years." Daniel stared at the glowing column, his mind racing to understand what he was looking at. "Compressed stellar matter," he repeated slowly. "You're telling me you're burning pieces of stars in there?" "In simple terms, yes," the commander said, "though your species would need many centuries to understand the physics involved." Daniel almost smiled at that, though he kept his expression neutral. He had noticed something interesting. Around the base of the great column, there were rows of smaller conduits, each one glowing slightly dimmer than the rest, running outward toward the walls of the chamber. He recognized the pattern, or thought he did. It looked almost like the load-balancing systems on human reactors, systems designed to prevent overload by spreading power across multiple pathways. "Those smaller lines," Daniel said, nodding toward them without pointing, careful not to make any sudden movements that might alarm the guards. "Are those distributing power to different sections of the ship?" Zorath Vek glanced at him, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. "You noticed that quickly. Yes. The core cannot release all its energy through a single pathway. It would destroy the ship. The power is divided and regulated before it reaches weapons, shields, propulsion, and life support." Daniel nodded slowly, filing the information away. Every great machine had a weakness, and often that weakness was hidden in the very systems designed to keep it safe. A power core this massive needed careful regulation. If something ever disrupted that regulation, even slightly, the results could be catastrophic. He said nothing about this thought, of course. Instead, he asked a different question, one that seemed harmless on the surface. "How many of these regulation systems are there? Just curious how redundant the design is." "7 primary regulators," Zorath Vek answered without hesitation, clearly not seeing any danger in sharing the information with a defeated prisoner. "Each one capable of managing the full output alone in case of failure elsewhere. Krithar engineering does not leave critical systems without backup." Daniel filed that number away carefully. 7 regulators, redundant design. That meant disabling one would not be enough to cause real damage, not with 6 backups still functioning. But it also meant there were 7 separate points where something could theoretically be introduced into the system, if one had access and the right knowledge. He was not planning anything yet, not really. He told himself he was simply an engineer, doing what engineers do, understanding machines. But some quiet part of his mind was already sketching the outline of a plan he did not yet dare to name. They continued through the engine chamber, with Zorath Vek explaining various systems in a tone that suggested he still saw Daniel as nothing more than a curiosity, a strange creature to be studied and occasionally indulged. Daniel played the part well, asking questions that seemed driven by simple wonder, nodding along at explanations, letting his face show the appropriate amount of awe at technology far beyond his species' understanding. But underneath the performance, his engineer's mind worked constantly, building a mental map of the ship. The location of the power core, the number of regulators, the layout of the maintenance corridors, the placement of guards, and how often they changed position. He noticed that the guards seemed almost bored, standing at their posts with the relaxed posture of soldiers who had never once faced a real threat inside their own ship. Why would they? No one had ever gotten this far inside a Krithar warship, and lived to tell of it. After the engine core, they moved to another section, one Zorath Vek referred to as the weapons control deck. Here, rows of Krithar technicians sat at curved stations, screens filled with strange symbols and shifting diagrams that Daniel could not read. Zorath Vek explained with obvious pride how the ship's main weapon, a beam capable of cracking a planet's crust from orbit, drew its power directly from the core, and how secondary weapon systems, smaller but still devastating by human standards, were positioned along the hull in defensive clusters. "Your species called it the hammer," Zorath Vek said, watching Daniel's reaction closely. "The weapon that destroyed your capital fleet in a single strike." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest at the memory. He had lost friends in that strike, good engineers, good soldiers, people who had trusted him to keep their ships running and had died anyway when the hammer tore through Earth's last line of defense. He kept his voice steady. "I remember. You built a shield technology that resisted the hammer for nearly 4 seconds longer than our projections predicted," the commander said. "An impressive achievement for a species so far behind us in understanding. How did you manage it?" Daniel considered his answer carefully. This was the exchange they had agreed to, information for access. He decided to give a partial truth, something true but not particularly useful, a habit he had developed instinctively the moment he agreed to this tour. "We layered our shields instead of using a single generator. When one layer failed, the next one absorbed some of the impact before failing too. It wasn't elegant. It was just stubborn." "Stubborn," Zorath Vek repeated, testing the word. "An interesting way to describe engineering." "Most human engineering is stubborn," Daniel said. "We don't always have the most advanced technology. We just refuse to stop trying until something works." The commander studied him for a long moment, and Daniel wondered if he had said too much, revealed too much of the philosophy that had kept humanity fighting long after logic said they should have surrendered. But instead of suspicion, Zorath Vek's expression seemed to hold something closer to genuine interest. "I have conquered 43 species in my career," the commander said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "Most surrendered within days once they understood the scale of Krithar power. A few fought until their worlds were destroyed. None fought like your species. None delayed the inevitable through sheer stubbornness, as you call it. I find myself curious what such a species might become, given time and resources beyond your own limited technology." Daniel felt a chill at those words, though he could not immediately say why. There was something underneath the commander's curiosity, something that felt less like academic interest and more like the beginning of an idea. He decided not to push the thought further, not yet. Instead, he focused on the tour, continuing to absorb every detail the Empire was foolish enough to show him. They walked through the shield generation deck next, where massive rings of dark metal rotated slowly, generating the energy barriers that protected the ship's hull. Daniel noted the placement of access panels, the location of manual override controls, the general layout of maintenance walkways that a technician might use during repairs. He noted that the shield generators, unlike the power core, did not appear to have the same level of redundancy. There were only 2, positioned on opposite ends of the ship. A weakness, perhaps, though he could not be certain without more information. By the time the tour reached its final stop, a long observation deck with a massive window looking out over the curve of a distant planet, Daniel's mind was full to bursting with details, numbers, and half-formed ideas. He stood at the window, looking out at the planet below, a strange gray-green world he did not recognize, and felt the full weight of everything he had seen pressing down on him. "This is Krith Prime," Zorath Vek said, standing beside him, his hands folded behind his back as he looked out at the same view. "The heart of our empire. From here we have conquered star systems for over 300 years. Your world, Engineer Voss, is merely the latest addition to a very long list. Daniel looked at the planet, then at his own reflection in the glass, a tired, dirty, defeated man standing beside a conqueror who had crushed his entire civilization without much effort. But behind that tired reflection, something steady had begun to form, a resolve that had not been there when he first stepped onto this ship. "You've shown me a lot today, Commander," Daniel said quietly, "more than I expected." "You earned it," Zorath Vek replied. "Your questions were intelligent, your composure admirable. I confess, I did not expect such qualities from a defeated species." Daniel turned to face him. "Can I ask you something honestly, Commander? Why do you conquer? What does the Empire actually want with all these worlds, all these species?" Zorath Vek considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Resources, territory, strength through unity, even if that unity is forced. The Empire believes that scattered, independent species are wasteful, inefficient, prone to conflict and self-destruction. Under Krithar rule, order is imposed. Peace is achieved, even if it is not chosen freely." "Peace through conquest," Daniel said softly. "Peace through strength," the commander corrected. "Your species will understand this in time, once the anger fades. Many conquered worlds eventually come to see the benefits of Krithar order." Daniel said nothing to that, though privately he doubted it very much. He had seen enough of Earth's destruction to know that no amount of imposed order would ever make humanity forget what had been taken from them. As guards led him back toward his holding cell that evening, Daniel's mind was already working through everything he had seen. The power core with its 7 regulators, the weapons systems drawing directly from that core, the shield generators with their limited redundancy, the maintenance corridors, the guard patterns, the general architecture of a warship built by a civilization that had never once imagined a prisoner might use their own hospitality against them. He did not yet have a plan, not a real one, but for the first time since Earth fell, Daniel Voss allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in months. Hope. Small, careful, dangerous hope. The kind that could get a man killed if he was not careful. But hope nonetheless, built not on wishful thinking, but on knowledge, on numbers, on the cold hard facts of engineering that Zorath Vek had so proudly shared with him, never once suspecting that his greatest weapon might one day be turned against him by the very prisoner he had chosen to indulge. As the cell door closed behind him and the blue energy barrier hummed to life, Daniel sat down on the narrow bench and closed his eyes, running through the ship systems again and again in his mind, searching for the thread that might, just might, lead somewhere useful. Somewhere in the vast darkness of space, far beyond the reach of the devourer of stars, the last scattered ships of humanity's resistance continued to hide among asteroid fields and dead moons, their crews exhausted, their supplies dwindling, their hope nearly gone. They did not know that their last engineer was still alive. They did not know he had just been given a tour of the very weapon that had destroyed their home. But Daniel Voss knew, and he intended to make that knowledge count. 3 weeks passed aboard the Devourer of Stars, and Daniel Voss became something he never expected to become: useful. It started small. A minor malfunction in one of the cargo bay lifts, something the Krithar technicians had been fighting with for days without success. Daniel, escorted past the bay on his way to another meeting with Zorath Vek, had glanced at the open panel and immediately spotted the problem. A misaligned coupling that no diagnostic scan would have caught because it was a mechanical issue, not an electronic one. He had mentioned it, almost offhand, and the technician had stared at him in disbelief before checking and finding he was right. Word of the incident spread quickly through the engineering decks, not because it was important but because it was strange. A prisoner, an alien from a conquered world with technology centuries behind the Empire's own, had solved a problem their own engineers could not. Zorath Vek heard about it within a day, and by the following week, Daniel found himself brought not just to observe, but to work. "You understand this is unusual," Zorath Vek said, standing in the doorway of a small workshop that had been cleared out for Daniel's use, deep in the maintenance section of the ship. "Prisoners are not typically given tasks. Prisoners are not typically given tools." I understand, Daniel said, looking around the workshop. It was smaller than what he'd had on Earth, but the tools, though unfamiliar, were clearly of a much higher quality. So why am I here? Because you are useful, the commander said simply. And because I am curious how useful you might become, given the chance. Krithar engineers understand our own systems perfectly. They have never had to think differently because they have never needed to. You, however, spent your life solving problems with limited resources, on a fleet held together by desperation and ingenuity. That kind of thinking has value, even to us. Daniel kept his expression neutral, though inside something sharpened. This was exactly what he needed. Access. Trust. A reason to be near the ship's critical systems without suspicion. He had spent the last 3 weeks quietly building a mental map of the devourer of stars, and now, it seemed, the Empire itself was about to hand him the keys. What do you want me to do? He asked. Small tasks at first, Zoreth Vek said. Diagnostic work. Minor repairs our own technicians find tedious. If you perform well, perhaps something more significant. I will remind you, Engineer Voss, that you remain a prisoner. Guards will accompany you at all times. Any attempt at sabotage will be met with immediate execution, and I assure you we will know. I understand, Daniel said again, and this time he meant something slightly different by it. He understood the risk. He understood the stakes. And he understood more clearly than ever that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for since the moment he asked to see this ship. The work began the next day. Daniel was escorted to various sections of the Devourer of Stars, always under guard, always watched closely by at least one Krithar technician assigned to observe his work. He fixed a faulty sensor array in the sensor bay. He recalibrated a malfunctioning airlock seal. He diagnosed a persistent power fluctuation in one of the crew quarters that had been bothering the residents for months, tracing it back to a poorly shielded conduit running too close to a data relay. Each task was small. Each task was also an opportunity. Daniel learned the layout of new sections of the ship with every assignment. He learned which guards were attentive and which grew bored and distracted after long shifts. He learned the rhythms of the ship when corridors were busiest, when they were nearly empty, when maintenance crews changed shifts and left certain areas briefly unsupervised. He also learned something else, something he had not expected. He began to understand the Krithar not as a faceless enemy, but as individuals. The technician assigned to observe him most often, a younger Krithar named Sesk, turned out to be curious rather than hostile, often asking Daniel questions about human engineering with genuine interest rather than the cold, clinical curiosity Daniel had expected from the Empire. Your species builds machines that should not work, Sesk said one day, watching Daniel repair a damaged relay using a combination of parts that, by Krithar standards, should never have been compatible. And yet they work anyway. We call that improvising, Daniel said, tightening a final connection. When you don't have the right part, you make the wrong part fit. Sesk made a soft clicking sound that Daniel had come to recognize as something like laughter. Krithar engineers would never accept such an approach. Everything must be precise, correct, efficient. Sometimes precise and correct gets you killed faster than a solution that just barely works, Daniel said. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect part when a ship was about to lose life support. Sesk considered this for a long moment. Perhaps that is why your species resisted the invasion longer than any other, not because your technology was superior, because your thinking was different. Daniel said nothing to that, but he filed the observation away carefully, the way he filed away everything useful he learned during those weeks. The Krithar respected precision and order above all else. It was the foundation of their entire civilization, their engineering, their military strategy, their empire itself. But that same devotion to precision might also be a weakness, a rigidity that could be exploited by someone willing to think differently. As the weeks passed, Daniel's tasks grew more significant. He was assigned to help with maintenance on one of the shield generator rings. The very system he had noted weeks earlier had less redundancy than the power core. Working alongside a team of Krithar engineers, He learned the generator's systems in detail, memorizing the location of control nodes, backup systems, and the delicate balance of energy flow that kept the ship's defenses functioning. It was during this assignment that the first real seed of a plan began to take shape in his mind. The shield generators, he learned, were powered directly by 2 of the 7 regulators connected to the main core. If those 2 regulators could be disrupted simultaneously, even briefly, the shields would fail across a significant portion of the ship's hull. Not permanently, not even for long, but long enough perhaps for something to happen. Daniel did not yet know what that something might be. He had no way to contact the human resistance, no way to know if any of Earth's scattered ships were even still operational, no way to signal for help even if they were. But knowledge, he reminded himself, was never wasted. Even knowledge without an immediate use had value, because plans could change, and opportunities could appear when least expected. One evening, after a long shift working on the shield generators, Zorath Vex summoned Daniel to a private meeting, something that had become a regular occurrence over the past weeks. The commander seemed to genuinely enjoy their conversations, treating Daniel less like a prisoner and more like an unusual guest whose perspective he found valuable. "You have performed well," Zorath Vex said, pouring 2 cups of a dark blue liquid that Daniel had learned was some kind of Krithar beverage, bitter and strong, though not unpleasant. "Better than expected. My engineers speak of your work with something close to respect, which is rare, given your origins." "I'm just doing what I know how to do," Daniel said, accepting the cup out of politeness, though he barely drank from it. "Modesty," Zorath Vex said, settling into a chair across from him. "Another human quality I find curious. In my experience, skilled individuals rarely underestimate their own abilities so consistently." "Where I come from, arrogance gets people killed," Daniel said. "I'd rather be underestimated than overconfident." Zorath Vex studied him for a long moment, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light of the chamber. "I have been considering something, Engineer Voss, a proposal of sorts." Daniel felt his pulse quicken, though he kept his expression calm. "I'm listening." "The Empire is vast," the commander said. "We conquer many worlds, but we do not destroy them without reason. Most conquered species eventually integrate into Krithar society, contributing their skills, their knowledge, their labor, in exchange for protection and order. I have begun to wonder if your species might follow a similar path, given the right circumstances." "You want humanity to join the Empire," Daniel said slowly, careful to keep any reaction from his voice. "I want to understand if it is possible," Zorath Vex said. "You are proof that human minds, though technologically behind, are not without value. Perhaps, in time, your species could be more than conquered subjects. Perhaps you could become contributors, engineers, builders, working alongside the Empire rather than beneath it." Daniel considered his words carefully before responding. This was dangerous territory, a conversation that could reveal too much if he was not careful. "That's a generous offer, Commander, but I have to ask, what happens to the humans who don't want to join? The ones still hiding, still fighting, still trying to survive out there?" Zorath Vex's expression grew slightly harder. "Resistance will be dealt with, as it always is. But cooperation, Engineer Voss, tends to produce better outcomes than resistance. I would think an intelligent man like yourself would understand this." "I understand it," Daniel said. "I just don't know if I believe it." The commander studied him for a long moment, and Daniel wondered again if he had said too much. But instead of anger, Zorath Vex simply nodded slowly. "Honesty, another quality I have come to appreciate in you. Very well, consider the offer, Engineer Voss. There is no urgency, but know that the Empire does not make such offers lightly, and it does not make them twice." As Daniel returned to his quarters that night, no longer a simple holding cell but a small room with actual furniture, a small privilege earned through weeks of good behavior, he lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, turning the commander's offer over in his mind. Join the Empire, become a contributor instead of a conquered subject. It was tempting in a strange way. Comfort, safety, purpose, all the things he had lost when Earth fell. But underneath that temptation was something harder, colder, more certain. He thought of the friends he had lost in the hammer's strike. He thought of the ruins of his workshop, the chalkboard full of unfinished equations, the life he had built before the Empire arrived and tore it all away. He thought of humanity's remaining ships, still hiding somewhere in the darkness of space, still fighting, still hoping for a miracle that had not yet come. Daniel Voss closed his eyes, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to fully commit to the plan that had been slowly forming in the back of his mind, since the day he first stepped onto the Devourer of Stars. He did not know yet exactly how he would do it, or when the right moment would come. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not become a contributor to the empire that had destroyed his home. He would become something else entirely, a weapon hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for the moment to strike. And somewhere deep in the ship's engineering decks, 7 regulators hummed quietly, carrying the full power of a captured star through their circuits, unaware that the man who now understood them better than almost anyone aboard was no longer simply an engineer. He was becoming a threat. The opportunity Daniel Voss had been waiting for arrived in a way he never expected. It began with an alarm. Not a loud, dramatic klaxon like Daniel had imagined during his weeks of quiet planning, but a low, steady tone that echoed through the maintenance decks, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps and clipped Krithar voices speaking too fast for the translator device on his collar to fully keep up with. Sesk appeared at the door of Daniel's workshop, his usually calm expression replaced with something tighter, more urgent. "Human ships," he said. "Detected at the edge of the system, small numbers but confirmed hostile." Daniel's heart began to pound, though he kept his face carefully neutral. Human ships. After months of silence, after believing the resistance might have been completely destroyed, there were still human ships out there, still fighting. "How many?" he asked. "Unknown. Sensors detected 3, possibly more hidden behind sensor interference. Fleet Commander Vec has ordered the Devourer of Stars to intercept." Sesk paused, studying Daniel carefully. "You will remain here under guard during the engagement." Daniel nodded slowly, but his mind was already racing. This was it. This was the moment he had been quietly preparing for since the day he first walked through the engine core and counted 7 regulators. He did not know if the human ships approaching had any chance of surviving an engagement with a warship as powerful as the Devourer of Stars. Realistically, they probably didn't. But if there was ever going to be a moment when chaos gave him an opening, this was it. For the next hour, Daniel worked in his small workshop under the watchful eye of 2 guards, forcing himself to appear calm, focused on a minor repair task he had been assigned earlier that day. Inside, his mind ran through every detail he had gathered over the past weeks. The location of the 7 regulators, the layout of the shield generator control room, just 2 decks above his current position. The guard rotation patterns that would shift once General Quarters was called, pulling soldiers away from routine posts toward combat stations. He waited. Patience, he had learned long ago, was often more valuable than boldness. A plan executed too early failed as surely as one executed too late. The moment came an hour later, when the ship shuddered slightly under what Daniel guessed was the first exchange of weapons fire. The lights flickered briefly, and somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to sound with more urgency than before. Sesk, who had remained nearby, was suddenly called away by an urgent message on his wrist device, muttering something in Krithar before rushing out of the workshop, leaving only the 2 guards behind. This was the imperfect, incomplete opportunity Daniel had been waiting for, not a perfect moment. There were no perfect moments left in this war, just windows, brief and dangerous, that closed as quickly as they opened. "I need to check the shield generator relay," Daniel said to the guards, keeping his voice calm and businesslike. "There's a fluctuation warning on my diagnostic panel. If it fails during combat, that's not going to look good for anyone." The guards exchanged a glance. They had grown used to Daniel's technical requests over the past weeks, used to escorting him to various sections of the ship for legitimate repair work. Combat conditions made them hesitant, but the mention of a shield failure during an active engagement was not something they could easily dismiss. Quickly, one of them said finally, gesturing for Daniel to move. They escorted him through the corridors, now filled with hurried crew members rushing to combat stations, the ship shuddering periodically under what Daniel now recognized as both outgoing and incoming weapons fire. The human ships were fighting, whoever they were, buying time with their lives against a warship that could likely destroy them without much effort. They reached the shield generator control room, a smaller chamber than Daniel remembered from his earlier maintenance work, currently staffed by only a single technician who looked overwhelmed, monitoring multiple screens at once as the ship's shields absorbed hit after hit. Daniel moved quickly to the console he had studied weeks earlier, his hands finding the familiar controls with practiced ease. This was the moment. Everything came down to this moment. He did not have a way to destroy the ship. He was not foolish enough to believe one man could bring down something as massive and powerful as the Devourer of Stars with a few minutes of unsupervised access to a control panel. But he did not need to destroy it. He only needed to create an opening, a single moment of weakness that the human ships outside might be able to exploit if they were skilled enough and lucky enough to notice it. Daniel's fingers moved across the unfamiliar Krithar interface, translating the symbols in his mind based on weeks of careful study. He found the regulator controls, the 7 pathways he had memorized so carefully, and began adjusting the balance between them, subtly, carefully, not shutting anything down completely, which would trigger immediate alarms, but shifting the load in a way that would create a brief, dangerous imbalance across 2 of the 7 systems. "What are you doing?" the technician asked, noticing the changes on his own screen, his voice sharp with sudden suspicion. "Fixing the fluctuation," Daniel said, not looking up from the console, his hands moving faster now. "If I don't correct this now, you're going to lose partial shielding on the port side within the next 2 minutes anyway. I'm just choosing when it happens, instead of letting it happen randomly." It was a lie built on just enough truth to sound plausible, and in the chaos of combat with alarms sounding and the ship shuddering under enemy fire, the technician hesitated just long enough for Daniel to finish what he had started. The regulator balance shifted, subtle but real, creating a narrow window where the portside shields would weaken, just for a few seconds, just enough that a well-placed strike might slip through where it shouldn't. Daniel stepped back from the console, his heart pounding so hard he was certain the guards could hear it. "There," he said, "should hold steady now." The technician studied his screen, confused but unable to find anything definitively wrong with what Daniel had done. The numbers looked strange, but not alarming enough to trigger an immediate investigation, not in the middle of active combat with more pressing concerns demanding everyone's attention. The guards escorted Daniel back toward his workshop, and he walked with them in silence, his mind racing, wondering if what he had just done would matter at all, wondering if the human ships outside even had the skill or the luck to notice a brief weakness in the Devourer of Stars' defenses, wondering if he had just risked his life for absolutely nothing. He got his answer 20 minutes later, when the entire ship shuddered violently, far more intensely than any of the previous impacts. Alarms blared throughout the corridors, and Daniel could hear shouted voices, urgent and afraid, echoing from nearby stations. "Direct hit," one of the guards said, his amber eyes wide with something close to shock. "Port side, decks 14 through 17. Daniel kept his face carefully blank, though inside, something fierce and desperate was rising in his chest. It had worked. Somehow, against all odds, it had worked. The human ships, whoever they were, had found the window he created and struck exactly where the shields had weakened. The victory, if it could even be called that, was small. Daniel knew the Devourer of Stars was far too powerful to be seriously threatened by a handful of damaged strikes, even well-placed ones. But small victories mattered. Small victories proved that the Empire was not invincible, that even their greatest warships had weaknesses that could be found and exploited by those willing to look hard enough. He was escorted back to his workshop, where he sat quietly for the rest of the engagement, listening to the distant sounds of battle gradually fading as the devourer of stars' overwhelming firepower slowly ground down whatever resistance the human ships had managed to offer. He did not know if any of them survived. He suspected, painfully, that most did not. The Empire's power was simply too great, even with the small opening he had created. Hours later, Zorath Vek summoned him personally, his expression unreadable as Daniel was escorted into the same private chamber where they had shared drinks and conversation just weeks before. 3 human ships, the commander said without preamble. Destroyed all of them, though not without cost. We suffered damage to our port shield array, decks 14 through 17, casualties among the crew stationed there. An unusual failure, according to my engineers, one they cannot fully explain. Daniel felt his blood run cold, though he forced himself to remain still to keep his expression carefully neutral. "That's unfortunate," he said carefully. "I hope the repairs go smoothly." Zorath Vek studied him for a long, silent moment, his amber eyes searching Daniel's face with an intensity that made the engineer's skin crawl. "You were in the shield generator control room shortly before the failure occurred, making adjustments, according to the technician on duty." "Routine maintenance," Daniel said. "There was a fluctuation warning, I corrected it." "A fluctuation that, according to my engineers, should not have caused the kind of imbalance that led to the failure," Zorath Vek said slowly. "In fact, several of my most experienced engineers believe the imbalance was deliberately introduced, though they cannot yet determine how, given the safeguards built into our systems." Daniel's heart was pounding so hard now that he was certain the commander must be able to hear it. He said nothing, waiting, unwilling to offer any information that might confirm what Zorath Vek clearly already suspected. "I find myself in a difficult position, Engineer Voss," the commander continued, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "On one hand, 3 of my crew died today because of a failure that occurred shortly after you were given access to a critical system. On the other hand, I have spent weeks coming to respect your intelligence, your skill, and yes, even your honesty, in a way I have rarely extended to any prisoner in 300 years of conquest." He paused, studying Daniel with those piercing amber eyes. "Tell me the truth, Engineer Voss. Did you cause this failure deliberately?" Daniel stood in the silence of that chamber, feeling the full weight of the moment pressing down on him. He thought of his workshop back on Earth, now nothing but ash and rubble. He thought of the friends he had lost in the war, the strangers who had just died in 3 ships trying to strike back against an empire that had destroyed everything they knew. He thought of the small, careful hope he had been nurturing since the day he first stepped onto this warship, a hope built not on wishful thinking, but on knowledge, patience, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to simply accept defeat. He looked Zorath Vek directly in his glowing amber eyes, and for the first time since his capture, Daniel Voss decided it was time to stop hiding. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." The silence that followed Daniel's confession stretched long enough that he could hear the faint hum of the ship's systems through the walls of the chamber, the same steady heartbeat of power he had studied so carefully during his weeks aboard the Devourer of Stars. He waited for the guards to move, for Zorath Vek to give the order that would end his life right there in that quiet room. He had made his choice, and he did not regret it, even facing what he believed would come next. But the order never came. Instead, Zorath Vek studied him for a long moment, his amber eyes unreadable, before he made a small gesture with his hand. The 2 guards standing near the entrance who had tensed at Daniel's confession relaxed slightly, though they did not leave. 300 years, the commander said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. 300 years of conquest, and I have executed prisoners for far less than what you have just admitted to me. Sabotage, the deaths of Krithar crew. By every law of the Empire, I should end your life this very moment. "Then why haven't you?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear coiling tightly in his chest. Zorath Vek rose from his seat and walked slowly toward the large window overlooking the stars, his hands folded behind his back in the same posture Daniel remembered from their first conversation together. Because I find myself asking a question I have never had to ask before in 3 centuries of service to the Empire. Was I wrong? Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the response. Wrong about what? About all of it, Zorath Vex said, turning back to face him. I have conquered 43 worlds, Engineer Voss. I have watched 43 species submit to Krithar order, some quickly, some slowly, all eventually. I told myself, as my superiors taught me, that this was necessary. That scattered, independent species were dangerous to themselves and to the greater peace of the galaxy. That conquest, however painful, ultimately created something better than what came before. He paused, his amber eyes drifting toward the window again, toward the endless stars beyond the glass. But you, Daniel Voss, have shown me something I did not expect. A species willing to fight, to resist, to sabotage even after defeat, not out of foolishness, but out of genuine, unwavering belief in the value of its own freedom. 3 ships attacked my vessel today, knowing they could not win, and still they came. And you, a single prisoner, found a way to help them succeed, even partially, knowing it might cost you your life. Wouldn't you do the same? Daniel asked quietly. If someone came to conquer your homeworld, wouldn't you fight back with everything you had? Zorath Vek did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Daniel had not heard from him before. Krith Prime was conquered once long ago by an empire that no longer exists. My ancestors fought exactly as your people fight now. We were the resistance once, Engineer Voss, before we became the empire that resists no one because no one dares to stand against us anymore. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Daniel had not expected. Then you understand, he said slowly. You understand why we won't stop fighting, no matter how impossible the odds seem. I understand it perhaps better than any Krithar commander in living memory, Zorath Vex said. And that understanding has created a problem for me, Engineer Voss, a problem I have been wrestling with since long before today's engagement. He returned to his seat, gesturing for Daniel to sit as well, though the guards remained close, watchful, uncertain of how this strange conversation would end. The empire I serve has forgotten what it once was, Zorath Vek continued. We conquer not because it is necessary, but because it is simply what we do, what we have always done, an old habit that has outlived its original purpose. I have spent 300 years telling myself this brings order, brings peace. But watching your species fight, watching you personally risk everything for a cause you believe in, I find myself questioning whether the peace we bring is truly peace at all, or merely silence purchased through fear. Daniel sat very still, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. What are you saying, Commander? Zorath Vek's amber eyes met his directly. I am saying that I am tired, Engineer Voss, tired of conquest for its own sake, tired of watching species like yours crushed beneath an empire that has forgotten why it began fighting in the first place. And I find myself wondering if there might be another path forward, one that does not require the complete destruction of everything your people have built and believed in. What kind of path? Daniel asked carefully, his engineer's mind already trying to understand where this conversation might lead. A negotiated peace, Zorath Vex said. Not surrender, not conquest. A true agreement between your remaining forces and the Empire, one that allows humanity to retain its autonomy, its culture, its identity, in exchange for cooperation rather than submission. I cannot promise the Empire's ruling council will accept such an arrangement. Many among them share none of the doubts I have developed over these past weeks. But I hold enough rank, enough influence to propose it, to fight for it. If you are willing to help me build a case they cannot easily dismiss. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a cautious, careful hope beginning to take shape into something more solid than he had allowed himself to feel in months. Why would you risk your position for this, for us? Zorath Vek was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because somewhere in the Empire's long history, we stopped asking whether conquest was right and simply accepted that it was our way. You reminded me to ask the question again, Engineer Voss. That is not a small thing. I owe you the chance to answer it, and I owe my own people the chance to remember who we once were, before we became conquerors instead of survivors. Over the following days, word spread through the ship of the confrontation between the human prisoner and the fleet commander, though the details remained closely guarded. Sesk, visiting Daniel's workshop one final time before Daniel was moved to different quarters, seemed almost relieved by the outcome, his usual curiosity now tinged with something like cautious optimism. The commander has requested a formal audience with the Imperial Council, Sesk said, to present evidence regarding your species. This has not happened in my lifetime, a fleet commander directly challenging established conquest doctrine. Do you think it will work? Daniel asked. Sesk considered the question carefully. I do not know. The council is old, set in its ways, resistant to change. But Commander Vec is respected, his record without equal in 3 centuries of service. If anyone could succeed in changing 300 years of Krithar policy, it would be him. Daniel spent the following weeks working closely with Zorath Vec, helping him prepare a case built not on sentiment, but on evidence, on the undeniable proof of human resilience, ingenuity, and the genuine value humanity could offer the Empire as partners rather than subjects. He shared stories of Earth's history, its wars and its recoveries, its capacity for both destruction and remarkable rebuilding. He spoke of engineers like himself, ordinary people who had kept impossible machines running through sheer stubborn determination, proof that human minds, though technologically behind the Empire, possessed a resourcefulness that could genuinely benefit any alliance willing to embrace it rather than crush it. The day finally came when Zorath Vec departed for Krith Prime, taking his case directly to the Imperial Council, leaving Daniel aboard the Devourer of Stars to wait, uncertain of the outcome, uncertain if his sabotage would eventually be discovered by someone less understanding than the commander who had chosen, against all expectation, to see something worth saving in a defeated, stubborn species from a small, unremarkable world. Weeks passed in tense silence. Daniel continued his work, repairing what needed repairing, learning what he could learn, always watching the stars beyond every window he passed, wondering what those distant scattered ships of humanity's resistance were doing now, wondering if word had somehow reached them of what was happening, wondering if there was still a chance, however small, for something better than total annihilation. The answer came on a quiet morning, when Zorath Vec returned to the ship, his expression carrying a weight Daniel could not immediately read. He was summoned to the commander's private chamber once more, the same room where everything had changed weeks before. The council has agreed, Zorath Vec said without preamble, to a probationary arrangement. Limited autonomy for remaining human territories. Cooperation rather than complete subjugation. It is not everything I hoped for, Engineer Voss. There will be conditions, restrictions, oversight your people will find difficult to accept, but it is a beginning, a door left open rather than sealed shut forever. Daniel felt something break loose in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the day Earth fell finally beginning to ease, even knowing the road ahead remained long and uncertain. A beginning, he repeated softly. Humanity will need representatives, Zorath Vec said. Voices willing to negotiate the details of this arrangement, to ensure your species is not simply absorbed and forgotten, as so many others have been. I can think of no one better suited to that role than the engineer who once asked a defeated enemy to show him a warship, and in doing so, changed the mind of the man who commanded it. Daniel looked out at the stars beyond the window, thinking of the friends he had lost, the world that had been destroyed, the small scattered ships still hiding somewhere out there, waiting for news that might finally give them a reason to stop running. I'll do it, he said. For all of them. Months later, when the first official human delegation arrived aboard a converted Krithar vessel to begin formal negotiations with the Empire, witnesses would later say the process began not with grand speeches or displays of strength, but with a quiet, tired engineer walking calmly onto the deck of a warship far beyond his species' understanding, requesting, politely but firmly, to see how it worked. It was a strange story, one that would be told and retold across 100 worlds in the years that followed, a reminder that empires built on conquest could still be changed by a single act of stubborn human curiosity, and that sometimes, the greatest weapon a defeated people could wield was not a warship or an army, but the quiet, patient refusal to stop asking questions, even in the face of impossible odds. Daniel Voss never became a soldier. He never commanded a fleet or led an army into battle. He remained, until the end of his long life, simply an engineer, the man who fixed what others believed was broken beyond repair. But in the history of humanity's long, difficult path back from near destruction, his name would always be remembered as the man who asked to see a warship, and in doing so, found a way to save what remained of his people, not through force, but through understanding, patience, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest act of resistance could change the course of an empire, if it was placed exactly where it needed to be.